Well, let's wrap things up with Proposition 114. And in person, we have Bonnie Brown, and via Zoom, Rob Edward.
I'm here.
Ah, there you are. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, thanks for hanging in there. It's been a long evening, but we appreciate all the, for all the candidates and all the spokespeople for the issues. It's been an informative evening. Bonnie Brown speaking against Proposition 114, Rob Edward in favor of 114. Opening remarks, Bonnie, 90 seconds.
Thank you for the opportunity to share our concerns regarding Proposition 114. I'm representing Coloradans Protecting Wildlife. I've spent the past 20 years working on wildlife conflict and predator management issues for Colorado farm and ranch families. Coloradans Protecting Wildlife is urging voters to vote no on Proposition 114. We already have wolves migrating into and living in the state. The Colorado Wildlife Commission has considered this issue 4 separate times and decided against it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife has also decided against it. 40 of Colorado's 64 counties, including Garfield, oppose Proposition 114. And I think most notably, the Southern Ute Indian tribe opposes this ballot measure. Look no further than Hanging Lake and the Maroon Bells to see the heavy recreational impact on our public lands. Limited habitat and more people is a roadmap to inevitable conflict, and it's not fair to the wolves. This year, Colorado faced a $3 billion budget shortfall and was forced to slash costs, including education and transportation. Next year, the state is looking at a $1.5 to $2 billion shortfall. So why are taxpayers being asked to pay for Proposition 114 when we already have wolves here in the state? Please vote no on this unfunded mandate to Colorado voters.
All right, Rob, 90 seconds.
Thank you, and thanks to the Chamber for inviting me to speak on behalf of wolves and Colorado's future. I'm urging listeners tonight to join the 80% of Western Slope voters who support wolf reintroduction through Proposition 114. Why? Because it represents an audacious act of hope for a better tomorrow by reintroducing gray wolves to Western Colorado, and in so doing, restoring the balance of nature. Put simply, Proposition 114 honors the multiple peer-reviewed scientific studies showing that Colorado is excellent wolf habitat. With over 70% of Western Colorado in public ownership and the largest elk population in North America and one of the largest deer populations, we are very confident in these studies' accuracy. Prop 114 gets politicians out of the way, directing the state's professional biologists to create a plan that results in wolf reintroduction starting by December 2023. The plan must rely on the best available science, and the planning process must involve the public. The measure also provides fair compensation to ranchers for the few livestock lost to wolves annually. Colorado is a lesser place without our wolves. They were wiped out by a narrow set of special interests in the last century. Now, through democracy, we can redress this heinous act of oppression. This visionary project provides voters the opportunity to restore the balance of nature to 17 million acres of public land, finally reconnecting wolf populations from the high Arctic all the way to the Mexican borderlands. We owe it to future generations to take that opportunity.
All right, first question, Mr. Edward. Why introduce a non-native species into an already full ecosystem?
Is this question to me?
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
6 seconds.
We are not proposing reintroducing or introducing a non-native species. We are in fact talking about restoring a species that existed here for millennia, the gray wolf, Canis lupus. And the specifics of any subspecies that might be considered for reintroduction here would be part of the planning process. So there's nothing beyond that to talk about.
Bonnie?
What concerns me about this reintroduction is we have the Mexican wolf population in Arizona, New Mexico, which has had over $44 million spent on it to preserve that unique genetic pool. And so now we have this mindset that we want to restore wolves from border to border, and Colorado would have a different subspecies of wolves reintroduced than what was here originally. And so I think that's very conflicting when you've spent millions of dollars just preserve one set of genetics, and now they're kind of kicking that to the curb, saying we're going to bring in another subspecies of wolves and try to connect from the Canadian border down to Mexico.
Rebuttal, Mr. Edward.
Actually, we've got members of the Mexican wolf recovery team who have provided input to our work all along, and they have no such concerns with the ultimate rekindling of that gradation of species. In fact, the Mexican wolf population would benefit from some northern genetic material, if you will. So we don't share that concern.
Next question, Bonnie. How will wolves affect the stress on, say, bighorn sheep populations?
Well, wolves are an apex predator, and they're going to stress any wildlife or domestic species that they're near. There's an interesting YouTube video out there, I believe, from Banff that shows a wolf running down a bighorn ewe and killing her. And so there is documentation that they would impact bighorns. We know from what's happened in the northern states that wolves impact moose and elk and deer, and certainly domestic livestock. So, a wolf is just a wolf. They're just trying to survive, but it does impact the other species. We have sage grouse on the ground, and there's a lot of concern about the viability of our sage grouse. And so those types of things need to be taken into consideration.
Mr. Edward, same question.
There is no evidence that wolves in Colorado are going to affect the bighorn population, because wolves will be ultimately taken from areas where the primary prey species is elk, because that's going to be their economy here. And they focus on those big ungulates, elk and deer, to the largest degree possible. They're not going to affect bighorn sheep or sage grouse. Certainly, they may have some impact on individual ranching operations, and that's why we've built in a compensation program to help ensure that there's economic remuneration for any problems caused there.
Rebuttal.
I think it's good that we look about our big game species that will be prey for wolves, because kind of the premise is we're going to release wolves on public lands, and that's where they're going to stay. We know here in Colorado that our big game herds that are on our public lands during the summer, in the winter come down to lower elevation country for the winter, and that's oftentimes private property. There's 186,000 private property owners in Colorado that own 30% of the forested lands, and so that's fine. So,
you can finish your thought.
oh, okay. Sorry. So it's fine to talk about wolves eating elk, but we need to think about where everything's going to end up. Thank you.
Next question, Mr. Edward. Who will pay for livestock losses?
As the bill is written, that will be up to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department and the General Assembly to ultimately determine funding sources for that, for depredation payments. But right now, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department pays for big game depredation out of a special fund. that it's set up for that. And we don't expect that there's any reason why they would have to rejigger that in any significant way.
Again, we consider this an unfunded mandate. Just because something is authorized doesn't mean there's money actually available and appropriated to pay for that. And so if you look at what's gone on with the state legislature in the budget process, and they're cutting education, they're cutting transportation, I think next year, when they're looking at costs, that the rancher that's on the ground that incurred some losses, there's probably not going to be money available. We see money in the other states run out for compensation programs. And certainly when we look at the history of this issue with NGOs promising there's going to be money on the ground to pay for things, that in fact turns out not to be true.
Rebuttal, Mr. Edward.
This is the first time that we will see a publicly funded compensation program for wolf depredation as part of a package of restoration. It's not an unfunded mandate. The money will be there. The money is already there. And in fact, the whole program, not just the compensation, but the restoration program, stands to be funded by the federal government to the tune of about 75% through Section 6 funds under the Endangered Species Act. So we're pretty confident that we can do this.
Last question. There's a question here regarding concern about gray wolf disease from infecting other animals. How can you prevent that? Yes.
Well, gray wolf disease or high data disease, it's important to point out that in the state of Idaho, that was undetected, unknown until they released wolves in the state. And so it is a concern. It is something that people can contract. With domestic dogs, we have deworming programs. The livestock industry, the sheep industry in particular, has state and national policy on deworming our dogs. And so that breaks the cycle. If you look at fox and coyotes, they can also have high data disease, but they don't interact with big game herds to the degree that wolves do. So you see wolves really interactive in that chain, pushing wildlife around, consuming those carcasses, and distributing those cysts that can be contracted by other animals and by humans.
Mr. Edward.
Well, this is a case of simple barstool biology, because every wolf biologist I've talked to has been very clear that the potential for transmission of high data disease to the members of the public is nearly zero. The way you prevent getting high data disease from any wild animal is to not touch their scat and put your fingers in your mouth. So this is a pure and simple case of fear mongering, and we just don't want to really discuss that very much.
Rebuttal.
Actually, if you look at some of the research on that, it can aerosolize. If you were driving a four-wheeler and ran over scat, or if you were out in your hay field with hay equipment and hit some wolf scat, those cysts aerosolize, and so you actually can ingest that.
All right, we move to closing remarks. We'll start with Mr. Edward, 90 seconds.
Thank you. Sorry, get to it here. Multiple biological and social assessments have shown Colorado to be excellent wolf habitat. Despite these assessments' results, the politically appointed Parks and Wildlife Commission has refused to ask the professional wildlife biologists within the Parks and Wildlife Department to develop a recovery plan for gray wolves. So, after a quarter century of due diligence, after multiple polls showing that people throughout Colorado who want wolves reintroduced are in the majority, we're giving all Coloradans a voice. This is not a partisan issue. This is not the Front Range versus Western Slope, since the Western Slope people support wolf recovery consistently in the majority. This is simply a question of the future that we want to hand our children and grandchildren. If you want to be able to hold your head high to say to the young ones of your family that you tried to make the world a better place, then I urge you to vote yes on Proposition 114 to restore the balance of nature to Western Colorado. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bonnie.
So, wolves once roamed the vast wilderness of Colorado, but the romantic notion of restoring wolves in our state collides with a modern landscape that's a complex network of roads, highways, towns, subdivisions, and federally mandated multiple-use public lands that receive an intense and increasing amount of recreational pressure. Western Colorado is not Yellowstone. The notion that wolves will restore the balance to the ecosystem is misleading, and it's only good for a fleeting moment before wolves decimate their prey base and the pendulum swings the other way. Proponents of wolf introduction have a long track record of litigation and interfering with on-the-ground management of wolves. Wolf advocates have filed 17 lawsuits on the Northern Rockies wolf program, and that doesn't include the lawsuits filed on the Great Lakes and Mexican wolf recovery plans. Wolves are not endangered. Over 80,000 wolves live in North America, and over 2,400 of those wolves live in and around the Northern Rockies wolf recovery area. Wolves should not be placed on a pedestal above other wildlife species. Because of extreme wolf depredation on moose in the Northern Rockies, Colorado and Utah have the last robust herds of Shiras moose in the Western United States. Please help us protect our cherished wildlife and let wolf migration occur naturally without ballot box interference. Please vote no on Proposition 114.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time and your diligence. This concludes our issues and answers forum for fall of 2020. We are on the eve of on the brink of a very historic and contentious election coming up in 19 days. I want to remind you to vote. November 3rd is Election Day. I want to thank our sponsors, the Glenwood Springs Chamber Resort Association, Glenwood Springs Post-Independent, KMTS. Thanks to Pat and Gabe for getting things going technologically. We thank you. Thanks to Angie Anderson for being our timekeeper. And thanks again to all the candidates and the spokespeople for all the issues. We hope it was informative and will help you make a good decision come November 3rd. Thank you for tuning in, for listening, and for viewing. And we appreciate everyone participating. Have a good night.